Okay, welcome. Greetings to everybody, especially to our guests and our moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment. Depending where you are in the world, it's good morning or good evening, but this is a worldwide event and it's being promoted throughout the world. We are also looking to ask and answer questions which sometimes don't get asked and often don't get replied, and I'll let Amelia explain that to you. My name is Alexander Reed. I have 17 years of Parkinson's. This transmission right now is coming from the brand new web centre of the European Parkinson Therapy Centre in Italy. We work with clients from over 45 countries to help them rebuild their lives, maintain quality of life, and adjust their new world of Parkinson's, along with the best therapy we can supply. Every week we will pass the control of the webinar, like I will do in a moment tonight, to a major organisation, in this case Parkinson Europe, who we are members of. We're very honoured to be members of. They used to be called the European Parkinson Disease Association. Thank you for changing your name. I always had trouble saying that name. So Parkinson Europe will be taking over. In particular, I have to thank, truly from the bottom of my heart, Amelia Hursey. She's been very patient with us and very patient with me. And she will moderate tonight's webinar on behalf of Parkinson Europe. Today, she and our distinguished guests are going to focus on a fact that different countries have access to different medicines. Hopefully, by the end of today, I'll understand why all our American friends arrive taking drugs which I've never heard of and may or may not be better. I have no idea. It's understanding the link between the FDA and the EMA and all the other organisations. If you have a question, just type it into the YouTube chat channel. Your details will be shown on the webinar, on the moderator's board. For the other webinars in the series, just visit parkinsonstherapy.com/web and you'll see that there are a lot of other webinars asking questions like, when will there be a cure for Parkinson's? Interesting question, for which I'm kind of thinking we're not going to get an answer to, but never mind. Enough from me. Amelia, if you're ready, it's a great honour to welcome you with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Amelia, can you hear me?
I can, Alex. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm going to hand over to you, and you can introduce your guests and take it from here. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you very much. I will do so. So thank you very much for that brilliant introduction, Alex. As Alex explained, I'm from Parkinson's Europe. I'm the research manager for the team and have been honoured to moderate this session and invite my three fantastic guests to come and be party to this evening's webinar for you. As Alex explained, the thing that we're aiming to discuss is one of those tricky questions about can we have equal access to medicines across the globe? And so I'm very honoured to invite my Anabela, Kieran and Jason to be part of this panel this evening. Now I'd love to hand over to each of them to introduce themselves. So Anabela, do you mind if I start with you?
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Anabela Marcal and I work for the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, since 1999, so I've been there almost for 24 years. Currently, I have a role at the EMA where I'm the liaison official to the US Food and Drug Administration. So, and in fact, geographically, I'm now based in Washington, DC, at the building of the FDA. So even if and my role currently is to try to improve and strengthen collaboration, to facilitate collaboration between the European Medicines Agency and the Food and Drug Administration. So these two agencies have a long history of collaboration for more than 20 years. And we collaborate in many, many areas, and there are other areas that we would like to establish new collaborations, and therefore this is the role of the liaison officials. It's really to facilitate these collaborations. So even if I'm representing the EMA at the FDA, I still work for the European Medicines Agency. So today I'll be mainly reflecting the work of the European Medicines Agency and how the European Medicines Agency engage patients in its activities. So I'm very happy to be here, and I hope I can help to explain a little bit how the European system works in terms of authorization of medicines and how you as patients can contribute for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anabela. That's a great introduction. And also, I know it's tricky to kind of formulate exactly all you do and all you're linked with. So thank you. I'd love to pass on now to Kieran Breen.
Okay, thank you, Amelia and Anabela. My name is Kieran Breen. I'm a neuropharmacologist. I've been working in the area of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's in neurodegenerative disease for over 20 years at this stage now. I'm a member of the Committee for Advanced Therapies at the European Medicines Agency, which deal with gene therapies, cell therapies. And I was nominated as a member of the CAT by the European Parkinson's Disease Association, as it was, or Parkinson's Europe now, 9 years ago as a patient representative. So most of the committees of the European Medicines Agency, which make a decision on approval of drugs, apart from one, have representatives of patient organizations and also professional organizations, so doctors and such. And our role is to make sure that the voices and the views of patients are taken into account when the decision is made on whether or not a medicine is approved. So I'm there not only representing patients with Parkinson's, but also just representing patients and the patient's voice. So my other role is also then to make sure that patients understand what exactly happens when a decision is made and how a decision is made and why a decision is made. So hopefully I'll be able to get that across today as well. But as well as being a member of the CAT, I'm also a member of the Patients Consumers Working Party at the EMA, and I've been involved in the Big Data Working Group and also the working group to look at the use of patient registries. And I know in Europe, for example, with Parkinson's Europe, there has been an initiative to use patient registries and patient data to see how can we maximize the use of that to try and understand more about Parkinson's. And at the EMA, what we've been doing is to see how can we make use of that to try and develop new therapies and understand the disease better, and how we can make use of this when we're trying to understand new therapies and ultimately develop and license new therapies. So again, maybe I can explain that if that comes up a bit more as well. So that's me. Back to you, Amelia.
Thank you, Kieran, and a very comprehensive review of all of the different pies you have fingers in. And so I think, yeah, we're going to have lots of really interesting questions to ask you. Jason, last but definitely not least, can I ask you to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Well, it's quite hard to follow, but I'm just asked to be the ignorant one on the panel, so that's why I'm here. I'm the person with Parkinson's on the panel today. I am 52 years old. I live in the southwest of Great Britain, in Devon, and I have run bingo clubs for 31 years. Somebody has to. I was diagnosed on the 26th of July, 2012, Thursday morning, 9 o'clock, And that is now 10 years ago and still is a very pivotal moment in my life. I had symptoms since I was 37. I was 41 at the time I was diagnosed. I've had the honor and luxury of visiting the European Therapy Centre in Italy twice, in 2015 and again in 2017 and again this year. And that has done the trick with me on both occasions. I'm a massive advocate for exercise being a therapy in itself. I've volunteered for Parkinson's UK since 2015, running courses for the newly diagnosed based on the Italian program that Alex runs there at the European Parkinson's Therapy Centre. And as a final note, my wife also has Parkinson's, and she was diagnosed at the age of 39.
Thank you, Jason. And absolutely, I mean, the joy of having you on this panel is so that you can check the rest of us if we accidentally fall down the line of acronyms, because it's very easy to do. So feel free to jump in and ask us anything, or ask Anabela or Kieran anything that actually you think that might not be making sense, because the wonderful thing about being part of this world is that sometimes when we're experts, we forget to stop being experts for a minute. So feel free, Jason.
I will put my acronym police hat on.
Thank you. So I'm so pleased about that. Also, just to kind of double up on what Alex said in terms of you as the audience members being able to ask questions, do pop it in the chat below the YouTube video, live stream, and they will come through to me. Now, I'm going to be completely honest, because we have a lot of questions that we've already got. We may not get to all of your questions. If not, then I'm sure we'll come up with another way of maybe getting back to you later, but some questions will be answered and some questions won't. There is no such thing as a stupid question. Feel free to put any question you want, including the challenge of what an acronym is, or if there's more information you would like about a certain thing. The idea of the format of this evening is so that, or this afternoon, or as you said, wherever you are in the world, is so that we can go through and unpick some of the questions that are already linked to this idea of understanding about getting equal access to medicines. And then we will have a little short break to allow the speakers to draw breath, me to sort out the questions, which will only be about 3 to 5 minutes. And then we will come back and then we'll go into general discussion about your questions as you have asked them. So don't worry, there will be very good time to pummel my lovely panelists with questions from you as well. So to start off with, if it's all right by you panelists, the first question I would like to throw out is about the most important question. I think it's the thing that a lot of us don't necessarily know or understand, is exactly what the European Medicines Agency and the Food and Drug Administration actually do. So having listened to that wonderful description of exactly what everyone does, Anabela, do you mind if I throw that to you first?
Yeah, of course, Amelia. Thank you. So, broader terms, the European Medicines Agency is responsible for authorizing medicines in the European Union. And I'll explain a little bit better. So basically, we are responsible for the scientific assessment and to supervise and monitor the safety of medicines for human and veterinary use in the European Union. How are we doing it? So the way we do it is we start from the very beginning. We have mechanisms to facilitate the development of medicines from an early stage. So we are not the responsibles to conduct clinical trials. So we are a regulator, we are a government organization. So we cannot have any interfere on the development of a new specific product. These are the responsibilities of the companies. But we have mechanisms in place that to support companies in their development. So from the very beginning, they can come to the agency and ask, you know, are we going in the right direction? I have a new endpoint, a new clinical endpoint. Do you think it's appropriate? And we can have these discussions. We also offer what we call scientific advice. So it's also a way of companies coming and saying, you know, if they have specific questions about any aspects of the development of their product that can be related to the quality of the product or to the clinical part. So they can pose specific questions. They can request what we call a scientific advice. And then there will be a group of experts from our scientific advice working party that will be looking into it and will be given some feedback to the company. And then, of course, it will be up to the company to take up that feedback or not in their development. Then if we move on from the early stage of development, our main function at EMEA is really to evaluate applications for marketing authorization. So the companies, once they are ready with their dossier, they will submit what we call a request for a marketing authorization. So they submit it, and the EMA, in particular, the EMEA scientific committees, and more specifically for medicines, for human medicines, it's the Committee for Human Medicinal Products, the so-called CHMP, will be looking at the data submitted by the companies and then taking a recommendation at the end if the benefit risk of the product is positive, meaning that the benefits outweigh the risks, or not. So if the benefits outweigh the risks based on the evidence that the companies have submitted, then there will be a recommendation for the product to be authorized in the European Union. If not, then these will be refused and the product will not be authorized and will not be available for use in the European Union. I think in next questions, we'll probably explain a little bit more about the process, how the CHMP works and how we really assess in a little bit more detail, but this is just the first question, so I'm just trying to provide a broad overview. And then, of course, one very important aspect is also to monitor the safety of the medicines. And once the medicines are authorized, but also before they are authorized, because any medicines have risks and have adverse effects. And these come up also as part of the clinical trials. So once the CHMP and is assessing the medicine, they need to look at the benefits, but they need to look at the risks. And the company needs also to provide information on how these risks can be minimized once the product, the medicine, will be available to everyone. So this is an important aspect also of the work of the European Medicines Agency. It's really to monitor the safety of the products during the entire life cycle, meaning before and after authorization. And to finalize, I would just like to highlight also that our role, we give lots of importance to transparency, to information to patients and to public in general. So we are very transparent on the work we carry on. For instance, all the agendas and minutes of the committee meetings are published. So if you want to know if a specific medicine is under evaluation, you will be able to check it because we publish the agendas and the minutes of our committees. And then, of course, once the medicine is authorized, we also publish the full scientific assessment from our committee, the Committee for Human Medicines, as well as what we call the product information, meaning the summary of product characteristics, that is the information for the healthcare professionals, and the patient leaflet, that is the information that will be made available for the patients. We publish also, we have a policy also on publishing clinical trial data that is submitted as part of the marketing authorization application. So we try as much as possible to provide information for everyone in a transparent way. So I think this is basically what we are doing. And of course, your question was about EMA and FDA. Pretty much, so I'm not representing FDA, but of course the FDA is the equivalent of the European Medicines Agency in the US. So there are some differences, there are some similarities, but I suppose we will discuss it a little bit later.
Thank
I
you,
think
Anabela.
that's it to start with.
That was an amazingly comprehensive overview, and I think that it's really helpful. One thing I'm just going to slightly clarify before I pass this on is that when we talk about clinical endpoints, they're actually just sort of human endpoints. So in a hospital setting, if something happens or you have your blood pressure checked and it changes, that can be what is basically a simple definition of a clinical endpoint, just in case anyone was interested in that. I think it's also really interesting to talk about those many different steps and not just the build up, but the afterwards as well. And so, Kieran, was there anything else that you wanted to add, especially about your role of making sure that the patient voice is incorporated in all of that process as well?
And I would just say, following on from what you were saying about clinical endpoints, usually a very important stage is when the clinical trial is actually being planned. That is what we recommend is that the company talks to the regulator to agree on what are the most appropriate clinical endpoints, and particularly what we call patient-reported outcomes. So it's one thing to say, and just thinking, specifically of Parkinson's. So it's one thing to say, a clinical endpoint is being able to stand up and walk to the end of a room in 10 seconds. But actually, what is important for somebody with Parkinson's? Is it that, or is it being able to have a good night's sleep? And I remember, speaking to people with Parkinson's, talking about what are clinically meaningful endpoints. And I think these are the sort of things that quite often come back when we talk, when somebody comes for scientific advice to design the clinical trials. The clinical trials are usually actually designed at a national level rather than the European level. But this is something that quite frequently that comes up when we start, when actually then that I see, when we get the final submission for marketing authorization, and it's quite clear that they actually have spoken about patient-reported outcomes as opposed to just pure clinical outcomes. So that's something that's that has come through, and I've seen this more and more over in my 9 years now on the Committee for Advanced Therapies, that patient-reported outcomes have a much higher importance than they had when I started 9 years ago. So I just make that as a point.
Thank you, Kieran. And Jason, did you have anything you wanted to sort of add into that little knowledge moment?
Not only clinical outcomes, but another point that Anabela brought up, which was patient information leaflets. I was interested to hear the involvement of the EMA and the FDA in those. And it raised a question, maybe it's for now, hopefully. What level of instance does a problem have to happen to cause it to end up on the patient information leaflet? How many times does somebody have to have a side effect for it to be included? Is there a scale, a number?
Yeah. So I suppose, yeah. Marcella, sorry, Anabela, you're right to sort of answer that. I can kind of answer the clinical trial bit, which is in the data collection. When you set a protocol together, you have your adverse reactions, adverse events that are already documented. But then I suppose at a regulatory stage, Anabela, do you want to add more details there?
Yeah, I'll be happy to do so. So in fact, in terms of adverse events, so when you submit your marketing authorization application, so you submit the results of your studies. And of course, in all studies, there is a requirement that you collect adverse reactions that occurred during the study. So at the time of the marketing authorization application, this information will need to be reflected in the package leaflet, as well as the information for healthcare professionals. And yes, there is a scale, so it depends on the frequency of the occurrence of the adverse event. You have like very rare events and frequent and uncommon. So there is a scale that is defined, and according to that scale, this will be reflected in the package leaflet. So we will know, and it clearly says very rare means between 1 in 10,001 in, so it's clearly put in the package leaflet in that way. So that's probably the short answer on that. And just perhaps I can already take the opportunity. I think we'll touch on it later on, but just also to let you know that package leaflets, it's a process. So the company submits a proposal when they submit the marketing authorization application, but there is like a discussion. So it's part of the discussions that take place during the assessment. So there are modifications that will be occurring during the whole time of the assessment. And frequently, we also consult patients when it comes to a certain phase of the assessment. We consult with the patient associations or with patients to really, do a kind of user testing. So, do you understand what is in the package leaflet? Does it reflect? So that we also do that process frequently. And so there is also one way that the patients can input on the during the assessment and on the information that is going to be provided to them once the medicine is authorized.
Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant, Anabela. And also, I think if anyone's having a problem picturing this leaflet, go and grab your nearest packet of medication of any form and pull out that piece of paper, and in it has got all of that information that we're just talking about. So it's in every single medication package out there. Just moving on from this a little bit, just because of talking about this difference of getting different medications in different places, would it be possible to sort of just talk a little bit about sort of the similar tasks that I think we've kind of covered a little bit of the similar tasks that the EMA and the FDA do, but also what the sort of slightly differences are and where there may be differences in this process of looking after the safety and the marketing rules between the EMA and the FDA. Who would like to take that? Anabela, you or Kieran, would you like to come in?
I mean, I can come in, but I wouldn't mind if Kieran also comes first. But okay, I can give it a go. So also for general knowledge, of course, here we are talking about medicines, but I think for general knowledge, it's also important to refer that the Food and Drug Administration also takes care of food and cosmetics and tobacco. And the European Medicines Agency is only focused on medicines. So just a big difference on that. Then when it comes to medicines and the role of these two agencies in the authorization of medicines, I would say, brothers speaking, it's basically the same thing. I think both agencies want to make sure that the medicines that are authorized are safe, are effective, and of good quality. And that's the main objective of both agencies. And of course, for that, these both agencies are assess the information that is provided by companies and any other information that is available in order to come to a conclusion on the benefit risk of a product. So I would say that the most important here in terms of similarities, it's really that we are both agencies responsible for the authorization of medicines, and our decisions are based on science or scientific evidence, and so it's science-based and science-led decisions. I think perhaps of interest also, there are in both sides, there are mechanisms for early engagement with the authorities, so developers can come early from a very early stage, even if the process at the FDA are different from the process at the EMA. But in both sides, there are mechanisms in place to support developers from very early. There are mechanisms in place in both sides, for instance, for accelerated reviews, meaning to have quicker review times to allow critical products to come into or to become available to the patients and authorize it earlier than the usual timeline. So these are some of the similarities. Perhaps it's easier already to say already some of the difference. Of course, there is a different, there are different laws in US and in EU what concerns authorization of medicines. So, and yeah, these are the legislation. So when a company submits in Europe, it needs to make sure that it's in accordance to the legal requirements in Europe. And there are, of course, some difference between US and between the EU. And we have a different organization in terms of Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency. So the European Medicines Agency, we work as we call as a network. So we work very closely with the resources provided by the agencies of the member states. So what we call the European network in the area of medicines, it includes the European Medicines Agency, the European Commission, and the member states, the agencies of the member states, plus Norway and Iceland. And when I say we work as a network, when I mentioned that we have 7 scientific committees and we have the committees, so the committees are composed by members that are nominated by the European Union member states, by the countries that are part of the European Union. And the experts we use during the assessment are the experts that are provided by these authorities in the EU. So we have a database of around 4,000 experts that we can use at any time for assessing medicines, depending on the area of expertise. When it comes to the Food and Drug Administration, everything is in-house. So yeah, the assessors are part of the Food and Drug Administration itself. So it's a different, by definition, it's a different structure. But again, as I mentioned before, an important difference that Kieran already mentioned is that the European Medicines Agency does not authorize clinical trials. So in Europe, the authorization of a clinical trial is still the responsibility of the European Union member states. So we give scientific advice, we can give advice to the companies, you know, on how to, in terms of their development and their proposals for development. But when it comes really to approve the clinical trial, that it's the responsibility of the European Union member states. But apart from that, as I mentioned, yes, there are always differences because there are different legal and regulatory frameworks, but bottom line, both agencies have, broadly speaking, same responsibilities in terms of medicines, and they really have the same final objective, that is really to approve medicines that are safe, effective, and of high quality.
Thank you so much, Anabela. I think that was really well explained. Kieran, did you have anything you wanted to add from the perspective of well, from your perspective on work?
I think I've nothing really much to add. I would agree that we both have the same, you know, aim at the end of the day, which is to approve medicines that are safe and effective for patients, and you know, at the end of the day, its benefit risk is the key factor. I think in general, my limited experience with the FDA is that Europe has a much better history of engaging with patients than the FDA. I think that they are improving, but I think generally we have a better history of that, both at a national level and at the European level. But that's all I would add.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I also think, just to sort of add beyond, I know we've been talking about the FDA and EMA, but of course, also in the UK, there is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA as well, which is now separated out, which also has a very similar aim to both of these. And I think, Jason, you've got a good question to throw at both Kieran and Anabela that might be able to answer.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my question is there been any issues or differences pre-Brexit to post-Brexit, and in the way that you just talked about the differences between EMA and the FDA, and has the breakaway of the UK caused you any problems or issues?
Well, I guess, considering I work in the UK, so but a bit of an interloper still being involved in the EMA, which but there was a lot of doom and gloom that companies would prefer to apply for a license in Europe rather than the UK. I don't know whether there's any evidence of that at the moment, to be quite honest, but I think we're still, the UK only really left the EMA back in 2020 essentially. So I think it could be a year or two before we see any specific evidence that is going to have any impact. But essentially what's going to, because there were a number of different potential models as to whether there would be reciprocal recognition of licensing and such, but in the end that didn't happen. So what will happen is, now if I want to develop a new drug and get it licensed, I will have to apply separately to the EMA for Europe and to the MHRA for the UK. And we don't have enough evidence at the moment as to whether or not companies are going for Europe or going for the UK. Obviously, Europe is a 10 times larger market. So the people were suggesting that there was going to be drug companies were going to be less likely to apply to the UK, but there's no indication at the moment as to whether that's going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Anabela, did you have anything you wanted to add to answer Jason's question?
No, I mean, in terms of in terms of the European Medicines Agency, of course, UK is no longer represented in our committees, but apart from that, I think Jason was also mentioning in terms of interactions with the FDA. I mean, our interaction between the European Medicines Agency and the FDA continues exactly the same. We have a long history of collaboration, and it was not impacted by Brexit. Of course, when it comes with MHRA, the UK regulator, as Kieran just said, they are no longer involved in the activities of the European Medicines Agency.
Thank you.
Thank you. So sort of moving beyond what we know is going on, and the history of the EMA and the FDA and what they do, can I throw out there the question about, are there new things that the EMA and maybe, and Anabela, and you're bridging the gap between the two agencies, are there new things that are being done that are quite exciting that people should really know about, especially to, I suppose, enhance the understanding of actually really trying the ambition to get medications out there as best as possible, but also serving the patient user population. Kieran, can I actually throw that one at you first? Because I know with you being involved in a lot of the sort of patient advocacy and voice groups, it'd be really interesting to hear about some of the initiatives you're part of.
Well, I think one of the things with there's a couple of initiatives with the EMA for one, for example, is called the Prime Scheme, and this is whereby we're trying to identify medicines that have the greatest promise and where there are areas of unmet need, and to try and get the medicines where appropriate, approved as fast as possible. So what happens is that when a new drug or a potential new drug has been identified, and it looks as if it has gone through maybe early stage clinical trials, and is done, gone through quality trials, some non-clinical trials, has great promise. It is then assigned to a specific group of experts who then actually essentially mentor it through the regulatory system. So rather than the company, maybe coming at various touch points and coming for scientific advice and then going away and coming back, they actually have somebody that they can have on tap, basically, and who can mentor them as the product is being developed, and can provide them with advice on almost on a day-by-day basis, and which means then that when they actually submit marketing authorization, there are no sort of major surprises, that they're not suddenly told, actually, did you not think of doing this, or did you not think of doing that? So that we're trying to identify these products where, as I say, there is great promise, there is an unmet need, so that these products are being brought onto the market at the earliest possible stage, given that they've shown safety, they've shown efficacy, and that there is this there is a benefit risk, a positive benefit risk profile. So there's a few other initiatives in the pipeline as well in that, so that we can try and streamline the process to make sure that where there is the need and where there are these products, they are brought on as at the earliest possible stage. I mentioned data. So one of the questions that has always been is, well, you always have to have control arm of the study, and you have a placebo control, and this takes time and is ethical and this and such. But one thing that we're looking at the moment is, could we use existing patient data as your control arm? So why not use historical data or existing data or real world evidence, rather than actually having putting somebody on a placebo control? And we have all this data, the big data initiative that has been developed by the EMA. So can we use this in a smarter way? So that we're starting to think about that the EMA 2020-2025 strategy is looking at all these ways in which we can start thinking about, can we work smarter rather than just doing things as we've always done them. So there was a lot of work done over the past couple of years to try and think, rather than just thinking sort of incrementally, the way it was like, okay, let's just think about, rather than where we are now in 2020, let's think about 2025. Sort of just move ourselves forward 5 years and think about where we would like to see ourselves, and just think outside the box and see how we get there. So there's these sort of initiatives are now starting to come on stream, and I think it's there's some very interesting ones, some very exciting ones about how we can move forward. So, and that's sort of from a regulatory perspective, but I think that's unfortunately that's only part of the problem. And I think I don't know whether I should go on to the unfortunate elephant in the room, which is the big question, and that is it's one thing to approve the medicine, and the big question is the availability, and I think that's the real challenge that we have in Europe. And I don't know.
Yeah, that's amazing. Anabela, do you have anything that you wanted to add about any other initiatives? And actually, I suppose you and Kieran have worked together for quite a while. I'm not touching about availability yet, because also I wanted to ask about repurposing. But Anabela, was there anything else you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I think Kieran gave a fantastic overview. I think perhaps some of the initiatives, I can just mention some of the initiatives we are taking on now as well, in addition to the ones that Kieran already mentioned. So the big data and Prime and so on. So one area that we are investing a lot in Europe, and the European Medicines Agency has been working a lot on it. It's in fact to transform the EU clinical research environment. And we have an initiative that we started early this year that is called Accelerating Clinical Trials in the EU, and the acronym ACT EU. And this is really an initiative that it's taking a little bit the momentum and the opportunity of the new clinical trials regulation. So we have a new European clinical trial regulation that came into is applicable since 31st of January this year. And just very briefly, this was also a very positive achievement in the sense that clinical trials still continue to be authorized by the European member states, but there is a big advantage for the developers, and because things are supposed to be quicker in a sense, because before the developers had to go to each member state to get authorization from each member state for their trial, and each member state had to assess the trial protocol and decide. Now we have, with the new regulation, to start with, there is IT system supporting all the submissions and all everything that happens for a clinical trial during the entire life cycle of the clinical trial. But in addition, there is this concept of work sharing. So if a developer wants to run a trial and to get authorization to run a trial in 10 European member states, they will submit it through the system. There will be one member state that will be identified as like the leading member state in the assessment. That member state will lead in the assessment. The other ones will just provide comments, and then on the basis of that assessment, final assessment, all member states will authorize the trial. So this is a big advantage of this new regulation. The other big advantage is in terms of transparency, because basically with the new regulation, everything that, almost everything, apart from the quality part of the dossier, everything linked to a clinical trial will be made available in the public domain at a certain point in time. So once the trial is authorized, you will have a number of documents that will be available in the public domain. Once the trial is finalized, there will be also clinical study reports. There will be study reports, what we call with lay language, so for the general public and patients to understand better. So this is a big thing in terms of in the area of clinical trials in Europe. But going back to the initiative on ACT EU, so accelerating clinical trials in EU, in addition to what came from the legislation clinical trials, there are a number of initiatives to develop guidance for new trial designs, so decentralized trials, complex trials. So there is a number of initiatives in that area. There is also a plan to establish a stakeholder platform as of next year to discuss all these issues related to clinical trials. So to discuss really facilitate the evolution of clinical trials environment in Europe. And this stakeholders platform, it will include academics, industry, patients, healthcare professionals, and so on. So this is one initiative that I also wanted to mention, in addition to what Kieran already mentioned.
Fantastic. And it's so interesting to hear about these new initiatives and sort of think about how they're massively going to change the relationship between the patient population and the organization's relationships, especially in Europe, because it is very exciting. It is brand new, and also that real push for transparency and the belief that you can do that. I think having been in the picture for sort of myself being in the picture for 13 years in clinical trials and drug development, it is a very, everything takes time. A cultural shift takes time, and so it's very exciting that we're seeing that. Sorry, Anabela, you were going to say?
No, sorry to interrupt you. Just perhaps also to complement, and Kieran has already touched on it, the other area that we are investing a lot is really on the patient experience data. And back in September, there was a workshop with different stakeholders to see really, where we are and where are we going in terms of the patient data experience. So this is an area we also are investing a lot.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Jason, was there anything from that perked your little ears up and went, ooh, tell me more?
No, I'm really interested in the stakeholder platform. I think that's an excellent idea. And the accelerated clinical trials body is it's good as well. It just makes obvious sense. So it's great that they're thinking in the way it seems patient-led. It's almost, as Kieran was saying about the involvement of patients in his work, it does seem that's driven these things on. So it's been encouraged to, at least. So very pleasing to hear.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And yet again, it seems like once upon a time everyone was working in little boxes on their own, but that is now time of the past. Also because of the Parkinson's connection with this webinar, I would like to just also slightly bring up the critical path for Parkinson's that was actually an initiative by Parkinson's UK, and it's a consortium, and actually it brings together not just sponsors. So when we talk about sponsors, they're like pharmaceutical companies, but also NGOs or patient organizations together who've all got a vested interest in Parkinson's. And actually by collecting together the knowledge and the data they're collecting, that then means the interaction with the agencies, so both the EMA and the FDA, is actually more efficient and more effective, because it's not all of these individual people asking questions. And as you know, both Anabela and Kieran have alluded to, actually, if people aren't sharing their knowledge, you get the same question again and again and again, and no one seems to move forward. But actually, it definitely seems in the Parkinson's world that there is a consistent move to try and stop the distribution of knowledge and actually bring it into places where people can find out more. I think it's quite an exciting space to be in. Kieran, you were going to come in there with anything?
Sorry, I was just going to say, but with regard to the critical path for Parkinson's, because I remember I was involved in Parkinson's UK when that started back in, I think it was that 2014, and you know, what we realized there that, you know, you had maybe, we'll just say 10 people with data on 200 patients each, and that if all came together, that was data on 2,000 patients. And that you had, it wasn't just tenfold, you were probably getting almost 100-fold increase in the power. And it was just trying to get people to realize that it wasn't their data, it was the data of the patients. And that the patients wanted their data to be shared, but it was just trying to change the mindset of the people to make them realize how important patient data actually is. And then we got into the whole area of GDPR, and that, you know, my data is my data. It's not the data of the clinician who holds it. And I think, you know, it's only over the past few years that the whole importance of the use of patient data in all aspects of clinical research, but particularly actually now from an EMA perspective, you know, the big data initiative has really taken off, and we're learning so much more from you know, both the development of new drugs, but also understanding drug-drug interaction, side effects, all these sort of things. And you know, the use of patient registries, the use of drug registries, it's really, really important.
That's fantastic, Kieran. And actually, that brings me beautifully onto a question that I had for all of you. And actually, I'm going to throw this at you, Jason, first, which is, how do we think that the Parkinson's community can help speed things up? What can we do to help make all of these initiatives and all this work actually come to life? What do you think, Jason?
Well, there's a few obvious things I would have said. First of all, get involved. Everybody is all very good moaning about it, but unless we get involved and do something, we can't impact clinical trials unless we all get involved and get ourselves involved, included in them. Also, not just getting involved in clinical trials, but getting involved in the decisions of which clinical trials to go with, the direction of travel of the industry, of our care. Because Parkinson's is so unique in its differences, you know, every single person being different with it. It's not the most simple of fields to try and find a cure for. I don't doubt, and money is an issue that is probably spread a little thin over the basis of all clinical trials, because there's several angles pulling at it if we're talking about symptoms. But so people getting involved, people with Parkinson's being involved in leading the research into what is really important for us. So that we hopefully get answers to and solutions to things that are really causing us problems. And the collaboration that you just mentioned, Amelia, whereby you're not duplicating research, and if the guys in Australia are doing something, they share it with everybody else, so we take the next stage rather than doing the same work. That was a really important piece of work that I think you said Parkinson's UK tried to pull together. So those things combined are what I would suggest is, from the patient's point of view, is what are important.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. That's brilliant. Anabela, from your perspective, what do you think that what would help you, and what do you think would help in terms of, really, if the Parkinson's community could help support activities?
No, I mean, I think Jason's message is really the right one. It's get involved, and just Kieran has mentioned previously just a little bit, all patients get involved in DMA activities, but there are a number of things. So perhaps I can just recap a little bit and just let you know how you can get involved, even as an individual, not even as an organization. So in fact, there is a long history of patients' involvement in EMA's activities for many years. So structurally, patients' organizations are represented in the European Medicines Agency Management Board, as well as in the majority of the scientific committees, as Kieran already mentioned. So we have a dedicated group, the so-called Patients and Consumers Working Party, that is a platform for exchange of information and discussion on issues of common interest between the European Medicines Agency and patients and consumers. So, and they get involved in a number of topics, as Kieran already mentioned, from clinical trials to many other topics. But in addition to this structural participation, there is a lot where patients get involved in EMA's activities. So patients can get involved in scientific advice procedures. So what I mentioned before, that companies, developers can come and ask for scientific advice. Patients, in fact, can get involved in this scientific advice, and we have had very good experience. We did an analysis that was published back to beginning of January this year on the positive impact and how it impacts the participation of patients in these scientific advice procedures. So in fact, there was a conclusion that 20% of the cases, the final advice to the developers was changed to take into account the patient's contribution and input. So in addition to scientific advice, patients can be also involved on what we call the scientific advisory group. So sometimes during the assessment of a medicine, the Committee for Human Medicinal Products needs to consult experts in a specific area, for instance, in neurology area. And these are the so-called scientific advisory groups that have people just with expertise in that area. And patients also get involved on these groups. We consult patients sometimes, or the patients' organizations, when we are developing guidelines. And we had a recent example where the guideline for good clinical practice, so the way clinical trials are conducted, that got really lots of feedback from patients and patients' organizations. And then lots of involvement in terms of review of documents. So as I mentioned before, review of product information, so the labeling that comes then with the medicines, but as well sometimes safety communication. So if there is a communication, for instance, on a safety issue for a product in a specific area, we lots of times consult patients to get their advice on the message that is being passed. And there is also the public hearing. So the pharmacovigilance risk and assessment committee, they have the possibility to hold public hearings. So there it's also another opportunity for patients to give input. So we have a multiplicity of areas where patients can get inputted. As I said, some of these participations are at the organization level. So it's the European organization. So we have what we call the register organizations with us, that Parkinson Europe, of course, it's in our list of eligible organizations. But there is also possibility for individual participation. So if we go to our website, to the European Medicines Agency website, and you go to the place of patients, organizations and patient participation, you will have a specific section where it explains how, as an individual patient, you can get involved in the European Medicines Agency's activities. So please get involved with give your voice, and yeah, I think this is the best way you can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Anabela. Kieran, was there anything burning you wanted to add on top of that, or was that the tour de force?
No, I have nothing else to add to that.
Thank you so much. So that was an amazing discussion. I'm now going to suggest we have just a 3 to 5 minute break to allow the speakers to have a quick stand up, sit down, and a quick drink, while I collate your amazing questions, and also while you have the opportunity to type some questions in the box. So speakers, I will summon you in officially 3 minutes time. But otherwise, audience members, thank you so much for listening so far, and some great questions coming through, and I can't wait to ask the panelists them in a minute. But yes, 3 minute respite break, and we will come back and bother you shortly. now have the great fun of answering or throwing out some of your questions that you've asked to our fantastic panelists. As mentioned, some of them won't be asked and won't be answered in this session because we are obviously limited to time, but we will now crack on ahead. And the first question I'm going to throw out to the group is actually a really interesting one, I think very pertinent for now, is about what we've learned and what's changed from what we learned from the COVID vaccination process, and how has this impacted on getting approvals. So who would like to take that lovely little nugget on? Obviously, it's enough of a charming question that actually none of the panelists wants to touch it. I suppose just to start off that discussion.
Sorry,
yes,
Amelia, I was frozen.
Don't worry, we've got you back now. The joy of technology.
Okay. No, I think I can just mention, you know, of course, COVID-19 in general, not only the vaccination, was a learning experience. And can you hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay. Sorry, because it's freezing a little bit. So no, I just wanted to say that we are having at the level of the European Medicines Agency, what we are having, what we call this lessons learned exercise. And one of the things, as you know, for COVID, due to the urgency of getting approvals, there were some what we call flexibilities introduced. For instance, rolling reviews, meaning that we are reviewing the data as the data was coming, instead of the companies waiting for having all the data and then submitting and so on. And some of these regulatory flexibilities will probably be looked at for future, you know, and extrapolated to other areas. So that's probably one area that you know, we have learned something for sure.
Thank you so much, Anabela. And I would say, I think, you know, as Anabela's just raised, we're still learning. There are still things being understood from exactly what's happened. And that amazing thing, I think, one of the things that really struck me from the COVID pandemic and how things were approved was the importance in collaboration, bringing knowledge together in such a quick way that then meant that the agencies could deal with it in a concise and effective manner, was very important. Now, I'm also going to caveat that with, obviously, the main focus of the globe all at that same time was solving COVID. It's a problem with capacity and people being able to do multiple looking at disease areas all at the same time with these agencies when you have competing factors. So it was a bit of an artifact in the way that approvals are given, because that was the main focus. That was the one that was the highest on the agenda. Now we're going back into a world where all of these different, you know, therapeutic areas are coming through the field again. It's going to be, you know, a slower process again, because there are all these different elements that are happening, I think, at the same time. Kieran and Jason, did you want to add anything on that learnings from COVID?
I think the main thing I learned is that you know, exercises such as this to let people know exactly what the process is. And you know, so I think maybe I won't say we took for granted that people understood what the regulatory process is, but you know, I think we really need to, you know, there was so much misinformation out there that I think it's good to let people know exactly what the regulatory process is, what needs to go through, how important it is, what the pitfalls are, so that you know, and to almost to anticipate where people may misunderstand what's going on. So that for me, because I spent most of my time for those 2 years trying to explain to people what actually is happening, as opposed to what people perceive is happening.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I think that's a really key point. Jason, did you?
Just on a side sort of issue, because I'm not privy to the processes, but what was encouraging was that when enough money and effort and expertise is thrown at it, something can come up very, very quickly. When the whole world looks at something, it comes up with a cure or a vaccine reasonably quickly. It would be lovely if the whole world looked at Parkinson's for a month or so. You never know what would happen.
Absolutely, I completely agree. But I think also some of the things that we missed about the COVID process was actually there was investment in the technology and the understanding way before it accelerated. So all of the framework and all of the kind of process behind it was already in play. So although there obviously was an acceleration to the solution, you can't underpin how important that investment and the stuff behind is. And I know it feels very much, especially in the Parkinson's world, that there's not huge leaps and bounds being made in a very visible way, but actually all of the steps of research that are going on that we're learning more about. And as Jason, you brought up, everyone is very different. Parkinson's is incredibly complicated as a condition. That there are bits going on, but I think just echoing what Kieran said, we need to be getting better at telling people exactly what's going on and how it's happening. And I think what I'm hearing is a resounding thing as well from Anabela and Kieran is that transparency. So one of the questions that came through here was actually, I'd like to know more about this. This is very interesting for academics, but I'd like to know more as a person with Parkinson's. And thank you so much for that fantastic question. And I think this is the thing, this whole concept of a lay summary that that the agencies are now pushing, that researchers need to, or sponsors, pharmaceutical companies need to put out there in the public domain, is now massively changing. So you will be able to go and find this information in a way that you couldn't do before. And there's been, not just from the EMA and the FDA's perspective, but also the Health Research Authority in the UK have just done a massive bit of work called Make It Public that also supports this. And that's all being driven by the voices of people like yourself and organizations like Parkinson's Europe to really ask and demand that. So as much as it seems like we may be kicking the can along the road, we're not. All of these steps and stages are the framing of the jigsaw puzzle as it's coming together. Next question. This is a really interesting one, and I'm very happy if people go, we don't quite know the answer to this, or just sort of what your thoughts on it are. But the question is, if a medicine is approved by the FDA, it can take, or feel like it takes, 5 years to be approved by the EMA. Now, is this actually the case, or what is happening?
Okay.
Kieran, go for it. Anabela, I will come and grab you once Kieran postulated.
The short answer is it depends on when the company actually files the marketing authorization application. So it might feel like it, but we don't know. If they put the application in at the same time with both, there's no reason to believe that they shouldn't be approved within. I think it does take slightly longer to get through the EMA than it does through the FDA, but that's because of the fact that once it goes through the EMA, it then has to go through the Commission. So it is a longer process within the EMA than it is through the FDA because of the actual processes involved. But once it's approved by the FDA, there's no reason why it should take 5 years to go through the EMA. But it depends on, to say that it takes 5 years is, I don't know where that comes from. So it really depends on when it's filed, what information is given, is it in the right format, and does it contain the right information, etc., etc., etc. So there's, it's impossible to say. It's the short answer.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Anabela.
Yeah, no, I think Kieran explained it very, very well. So in fact, first to start with, it depends. Sometimes companies have different strategies. They decide to submit first in certain parts of the world and in other parts. So, and as regulators, we cannot influence that. It's not up to us. We cannot oblige a
company to submit in a certain, in Europe or wherever in the world. So this is really the strategy of the company. Now, when it comes to the assessment time, so our assessment times are defined by the European legislation. So that we have a maximum, once the dossier is submitted, we have a maximum of what we call 210 days of assessment. But this is what we call the active time for assessment, meaning that it's the time that our Committee for Human Medicines is really looking into it and assessing. Then, as Kieran mentioned, depending on the data that has been submitted on the dossier, during the assessment, the CHMP may have questions and may have, major, what we call major objections, so some major questions in relation to the data that have been submitted. And then they will put these questions back to the company. And then these are times that the company will need to reply. And then again, it depends on the times that the company will take to reply these questions. So sometimes can be 1 month, sometimes can be 6 months, and it could be that there will be different rounds of questions, because if the company is not able to clarify everything, or if there are still scientific clarifications that are needed, we could have a second round of questions or even a third round of questions. So it's really difficult, as Kieran was saying, to time box how long it will take. But as I mentioned, for sure, on the side of the European Medicines Agency and its committees, we cannot take longer than 210 days, active days, so assessment days. But then there is all the other things in between.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's an interesting thing, because it's not it's not like a step down process. There's sort of all sorts of different moving parts in this. And actually, to me, just kind of resonating what you said before, if the sponsors who are creating the treatment have built a very good relationship with the EMA or the FDA ahead of time, then actually that seems to be a smoother working process, because you've already got what might be a future barrier. So actually, the knock-on effect that I think that is perceived by the consumer audience is actually partly driven by the responsibilities of the organizations to make this relationship happen with the EMA and the FDA ahead of time, so that they're not missing out on the option to smooth their process rather than have to deal with things in this repeated question way. Jason, you had a question you would like to throw at Kieran and Anabela.
I have, following up on that, the last discussion about the differences in times, just to give an actual example. I don't know if you know this case or not, but the University of Maryland came up with ultrasound treatment that was approved by the FDA in November 21. I just wondered if they've actually applied, or where they are in the process, if you know at all. Just to give a real world example.
I personally don't. Kieran, do you have any knowledge of this?
Okay, ultrasound treatment wouldn't come to the EMA. Ultrasound treatment would go to the national authority, because it's not a drug.
Right.
Is the short answer.
That's really helpful, because I think this is also another thing that is quite useful to unpick, is that not everything goes through the EMA. And actually, as we're talking about technology and all that kind of stuff coming through, actually it's good to understand there are lines to sort of what we can do. I do have a question higher up about or actually just sort of coming about people getting access to the same medications. So one is the example of Rytary, which was a drug that was supported by Michael J. Fox, but actually didn't get licensed in Europe. And or is there something else that they've renamed it? Just sometimes treatments that are licensed in America have to change their name to be licensed in the EU.
You wouldn't have to change your name just to get relicensed, or you wouldn't just have to change your name to be licensed.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
This is your answer.
now you don't need to change your name, so it's again a strategy of the company, but we have an official review. We have a group that reviews the names, and there are certain rules that need to be applied for names of medicines in Europe. So that's part of the assessment. When the company submits a dossier, there is a group that we have that is the name review group. You know, because we don't want to create any confusion, or if there is already a medicine with a similar name but for a different indication, or so there are rules, there are criteria for on which we based to, you know, to decide if that the name proposed by the company is acceptable or not. And if it's not acceptable, then the company will need to come up and propose a new name. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think also, just to sort of go on top of that, there is, yet again, the sort of slightly different rules in terms of safety and all of that kind of stuff. So it can be a number of different things why a treatment may not be available across the globe, but also the decision of the company who is making that product about where they're applying to for marketing regulation as well. So it's not necessarily a block that's caused by the regulatory authorities themselves.
Yeah. Now, just Amelia, just to clarify, so one thing, of course, the question was on the name, but then on the aspect you were referring to, that authorization versus non-authorization, yeah, it depends if the company submits it to both regions or not. But if submitted to both regions, of course, we have cases that different regulatory agencies have different views on the benefit risk of a product. So sometimes also the dossiers that are submitted are slightly different. So mainly if it's in a different point in time, it could be that, you know, if submitted earlier to one agency and then later to another agency, the one submitted later, perhaps there will be further evidence or further data from other clinical trials. So there are multiple reasons why two different agencies can have different outcomes in terms of the recommendation or in terms of the benefit risk of a medicine. So
thank you so much. I think that's a great answer. And there's a sort of a few questions that sort of looked in that direction as well. So thank you. So we're getting towards the end of the webinar. So what I would really like to do, just to sort of bring us to a lovely close, is ask each of my lovely panelists if there is a take-home message that they would like the listening audience to, or the watching audience to have. For me, I think it's that thing of don't be afraid of going out there and looking and finding out, you know, feel free to approach local organizations and national bodies as well to find out more. So that would be mine. Who would like to go first with their next call to action? Jason. Woo.
Get involved. Simple. We need as many people as possible getting involved in all the aspects of research and development, and with the EMA and wherever it's required. It's not going to get solved without us.
No, and it won't be solved on your behalf because they won't know what to ask. So it's very important that you share all your knowledge and your skills so that we know exactly what to go and ask and get up to. I would 100% support that, Jason. Kieran, what would your call to action be for our watching audience?
I would sort of combine both what you and Jason said. So, you know, when people think of getting involved in research, they think of, you know, drug trials and such. There's much more to it than that. So, you know, I have been involved in research now for many years, and when people are doing research, they're you know, it could be physiotherapy research, it could be just filling in questionnaires, it could be validating clinical trial scores. There's so many different ways. And I think one thing that Parkinson's Europe can help, and in fact does help at the national level, is getting getting national organizations and even local organizations to engage with local universities and clinicians and clinics to let people know what's going on, and to help to get people with Parkinson's involved, to let them know what's happening. Because I know people want to get involved in research, you know, to see how much they can help. And I know people want to engage with people with Parkinson's. And I think this is where charities can have a key role to play. And obviously from our perspective at the EMA, if there's anything we can do to help, promote research, promote trials, promote research, that's what we're here to do as well.
Thank you so much, Kieran. That was a great summary. And Anabela, what would be your brief take-home call to action message?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really from our long experience at the European Medicines Agency, patients' input is really of value. We have proven it. We have made analysis on that. So your input is valuable. It adds value to the assessment of medicines and to the early development of medicines. So please get involved through your organizations or individually. Your input is really valid and it can make a difference. So yeah, that will be my message.
Thank you so much. This has been brilliant. And I really hope that everyone who's been listening has a bit of an understanding about why or how the process in terms of getting medicines and what the agencies that are linked up with that are kind of doing and experiencing. I know I've never listened to a webinar or been part of a webinar that kind of goes into this detail in this area. So I want to say, firstly, a massive thank you to the wonderful panelists, Anabela, Kieran and Jason, who've been part of this, and also what an honor it is to bring this knowledge, I think, to a wider audience. Do feel free to ask questions later or get in contact with the European Therapy Centre about anything you would like to know. But for this evening, you are all now, or today, wherever you are in the world, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to my panelists, and I hope that you've all taken something away that you will do something with in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.